Hello, everyone. Hello, 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 and welcome to Divine Femininity United. I'm your girl, Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee, and we are here for another segment of our amazing book that we've been reading through. It is called A Wrinkle in Time. This book has been absolutely fun to read, number one. And then number two, it's been dropping so many gems regarding the other dimensions and astral projecting and spiritual gifts and clairvoyance and channeling and ooh, ooh. Actually, you all, here's a tidbit that you probably didn't know. This book is banned. This is on the banned list. And I know why. Because listen, it's our understanding that gains us the wisdom and the knowledge and the foresight to be able to do what it is that we do and navigate some of these crazy what the Bible called perilous times that we're in. It's the knowledge. Even in the scripture, it says the people perish for the lack of not because of the lack of knowledge. So the knowledge is the weapon. Knowledge is the weapon, you all. Knowledge is the weapon. So the more we know, the more insight we have, the better we can move and decide, choose and connect and all of those things. That is the problem. The weapon, the real weapon is not picketing. It's not the taking the knee. I understand solidarity. I understand, I understand the front line. I understand all that. But I also understand that the reason that we can be continually oppressed as a people is because our ignorance is what they use. Our weapon is the knowledge and wisdom that we glean, that we gain. Unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge that we need is written inside of books or it's in conversations, it's in gatherings, it's in asking questions and all of the right kind of questions. But unfortunately, as a whole, we are easily entertained, we are easily distracted, we are easily lured. We have shown ourselves to be at overall predictable. Okay. We're reactive, and this is not a us bashing. This is us facing truth, right? This is our truth. The real weapon is in knowledge, the know-how, awareness, consciousness, and then application of the knowledge. Because it's not knowledge doesn't turn to wisdom unless applied. Okay. So we have to learn. You got to learn. If you don't know the powers that you possess, the one who knows your powers can use your ignorance and your lack of knowing of your power against you. They know our powers. And they also know that we're stronger together, which is why they bridge a divide. We are stronger together. We are a powerful people. The problem is we don't know that. So we operate off of fear. We allow ourselves to be ruled by emotion. We believe what's the propaganda that's being told to us. We keep our eyes on the news, which is one of the worst things to do, because the news does not tell us what's actually happening. The news tells us what it wants us to think or know. Television. It's telling you what to see, what to hear. It's controlling what you see and what you hear, and how you feel and what's in your mind. That's what's happening. As soon as we realize that as a whole, we will no longer be lured as a whole. We will no longer be overruled and controlled and manipulated and all of those things as a whole. It's when we understand who we are. And I think books like this, To Kill a Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men, a slew, Color Purple, oh my goodness, a slew of books that are now banned. That's where your knowledge comes in at, that type of stuff. There's a reason why Nikola Tesla's work was stolen. All but 30 files, 30 books, 30 boxes of his work stolen. He knew too much. Okay? There's a reason why previous people who, the black man that created the water operating vehicle was a security guard at that grocery store that all of a sudden had a random shooting, killed 9 people. I believe that was New York. The shooter drove from a whole other state to this quote unquote random grocery store where this inventor of this vehicle that operates off of water just so happened to be securing. And of course, he was a target, but the rest of the people that passed away, collateral damage, they had to make it look like it was a random shootout. He was the target. He knew too much. Knew too much. That's the threat. Knowing too much. The only thing that we need to know, to be honest, the only thing that we need to know is who we are. Once we understand who we are, every single thing that tries to oppose you will be seen as an opportunity to demonstrate who you are. Period. They know our power. They know our power. If we were insignificant as they say we are, they sure is worried about some insignificant people. They real frazzled about some non-factors, irrelevant folks, right? Real worried. But yet the same irrelevant folks raised your kids. In fact, not only raised your children, fed off of our foremothers' breast, cooked your food, cleaned your house. If we were so insignificant, then why are you having us to do all of your work? That's the thing. And not only having us to do all the work, but also emulating us. But we're so insignificant, right? No, the problem is you're threatened. You are insignificant in your own eyes in comparison to us. And that's why you fear us. And that's why you have to use the mask of superiority, the mask, because you already know that you're not. In fact, we could all share this beautiful planet together if everybody wanted to see each other as an equal. But no, you all were the ones that started the labels and the categories, and we're here, you all are there. We didn't do that at all. From the very beginning, you all were threatened. They were threatened by us, our people, threatened, but yet admired us at the same time, fearful of us, but admired us, jealous of us, inspired by us, wanting to be us, learning our culture, learning our practices, wanting our women, wanting our men, taking our children. Oh my goodness. Something else. It's the knowledge, you all. So when we get books like this right here that's been banned, on the ban list, then it's an honor to be able to read it and garner the wisdom, glean from it, feed off of it, really align with it, let it flow through you, activate you. And then from that moment on, you demonstrate from that new activation. That's what it is. That's all it is, to be honest. Okay. With all of that being said, we are reading chapters 8 and 9 today. Chapter 8 is entitled The Transparent Column. Chapter 9 is entitled It. I-T. It. Okay. So, at any point, because you already know, we are airing live on multiple platforms. Okay. Wherever you're airing from, I want to thank you for being here. Wherever you're listening in and watching from, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for your presence, your energy. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you have anything if you hear anything that I read and it stands out to you and it resonates with you, go ahead and drop something in the comments. I'm here to give voice to your words, okay? But if you want to just listen, then go ahead and go right ahead. You're more than welcome to listen, okay? All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started with chapter 8, The Transparent Column. Remember the last time, Charles Wallace was lured into a trance by the red-eyed man, okay? They're inside of this capital intelligence, central intelligence center or whatever, and they ran into him, and he's doing mind control pretty much, but he can only do this on Charles Wallace because Charles Wallace has the gift that he wants, which is the gift of I don't want to say it's clairvoyance. He also can see beyond. He's a seer, and he's 5 years old. He has that gift. Okay. So he's now inside of Charles Wallace's head. He's now mind controlling Charles Wallace. Okay. Now, here we go. Chapter 8, The Transparent Column. Charles Wallace sat there tucking away turkey and dressing as though it were the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He was dressed like Charles Wallace. He looked like Charles Wallace. He had the same sandy brown hair, the same face that had not yet lost its baby roundness. Only the eyes were different, for the black was still swallowed up in blue. But it was far more than this that made Meg feel that Charles Wallace was gone, that the little boy in his place was only a copy of Charles Wallace, only a doll. She fought down a sob. Where is he? She demanded of the man with red eyes. What have you done with him? Where's Charles Wallace? But, my dear child, you are hysterical, the man thought at her. Now, mind you, also, he's not using words. This is telepathy as well. There's another thing that's exposed there because the language of the universe is telepathic. Okay. All right. He says, the man thought at her. He's right there before you, well and happy, completely well and happy for the first time in his life. And he is finishing his dinner, which you also would be wise to do. You know it isn't Charles, Meg shouted. You've got him somehow. Hush, Meg. There's no use trying to talk to him, Calvin said, speaking in a low voice into her ear. What we have to do is hold Charles Wallace tight. He's there somewhere underneath, and we mustn't let them take him away from us. Help me hold him. Don't lose control of yourself, Meg. Not now. You've got to help me hold Charles. He took the little boy firmly by one arm. Fighting down her hysteria, Meg took Charles's other arm and held it tightly. You're hurting me, Meg, Charles said sharply. Let me go. No, Meg said grimly. We've been all wrong, Charles Wallace's voice, Meg thought, might have been a recording. There was a canned quality to it. He isn't an enemy at all. He's our friend. Nuts, Calvin said rudely. You don't understand, Calvin, Charles Wallace said. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which have confused us. They're the ones who are really our enemies. We never should have trusted them for a minute. He spoke in his calmest, most reasonable voice, the voice which infuriated the twins. He seemed to be looking directly at Calvin as he spoke, and yet Meg was sure that the bland blue eyes could not see, and that something else, was looking at Calvin through Charles. Now the cold, strange eyes turned to her. Meg, let go. I will explain it all to you. but you must let go. No, Meg gritted her teeth. She did not release her grasp, and Charles Wallace began to pull away with a power that was not his own, and her own spindly strength was no match against it. Calvin, she gasped as Charles Wallace wrenched his arm from her and stood up. Calvin the athlete, Calvin the boy who split firewood and brought it in for his mother, whose muscles were strong and controlled, let go Charles Wallace's wrist and tackled him as though he were a football. Meg, in her panic and rage, darted at the man on the chair, intending to hit him as Charles Wallace had done, but the black smocked men were too quick for her, and one of them held her with her arms pinioned behind her. Calvin, I advise you to let me go, came Charles Wallace's voice from under Calvin. Calvin, his face screwed up with grim determination, did not relax his hold. The man with red eyes nodded, and three of the men moved in on Calvin. At least it took three of them, pried him loose, and held him as Meg was being held. Mrs. Whatsit, Meg called despairingly. Oh, Mrs. Whatsit. But Mrs. Whatsit did not come. Meg, Charles Wallace said, Meg, you just listen to me. Okay, I'm listening. We've been all wrong, I told you. We haven't understood. We've been fighting our friend and Father's friend. If Father tells me he's our friend, maybe I'll believe it. Maybe, unless he's got Father under a spell or whatever it is, like you. This isn't a fairy tale. Spells indeed, Charles Wallace said. Meg, you've got to stop fighting and relax. Relax and be happy. Oh, Meg, if you just relax, you'd realize that all our troubles are over. You don't understand what a wonderful place we've come to. You see, on this planet, everything is in perfect order because everybody has learned to relax, to give in, to submit. All you have to do is look quietly and steadily into the eyes of our good friend here, for he is our friend, dear sister, and he will take you in as he's taken me. Taking you in is right, Meg said. You know you're not you. You know you've never in your life called me dear sister. Shut up a minute, Meg, Calvin whispered to her. He looked up at the man with red eyes. Okay, have your henchmen let us go and stop talking to us through Charles. We know it's you talking, or whatever is talking through you. Anyhow, we know you have Charles hypnotized. A most primitive way of putting it, the man with red eyes murmured. He gestured slightly with one finger, and Meg and Calvin were released. Thanks, Calvin said wryly. Now, if you are our friend, will you tell us who or what you are? It is not necessary for you to know who I am. I am the prime coordinator. That is all you need to know. But you're being spoken through, aren't you? Just like Charles Wallace. Are you hypnotized too? I told you that that was too primitive a word, without the correct connotation. Is it you who are going to take us to Mr. Murry? No, it is not necessary, nor is it possible for me to leave here. Charles Wallace will conduct you. Charles Wallace? Yes. When? Now. The man with red eyes had the frightening grimace that passed for his smile. Yes, I think it might as well be now. Charles Wallace gave a slight jerk of his head, saying, Come, and started to walk in a strange, gliding, mechanical manner. Calvin followed him. Meg hesitated, looking from the man with red eyes to Charles and Calvin. She wanted to reach out and grab Calvin's hand, but it seemed that ever since they had begun their journeyings, she had been looking for a hand to hold, so she stuck her fists into her pockets and walked along behind the two boys. I've got to be brave, she said to herself. I will be. They moved down a long, white, and seemingly endless corridor. Charles Wallace continued the jerky rhythm of his walk and did not once look back to see if they were with him. Suddenly, Meg broke into a run and caught up with Calvin. Cal, she said, listen, quick. Remember Miss Watson said your gift was communication, and that was what she was giving you? We've been trying to fight Charles physically, and that isn't any good. Can't you try to communicate with him? Can't you try to get into him? Golly day, you're right. Calvin's face lit up with hope, and his eyes, which had been somber, regained their usual sparkle. I've been in such a swivet. It may not do any good, but at least I can try. They quickened their pace until they were level with Charles Wallace. Calvin reached out for his arm, but Charles flung it off. Leave me alone, he snarled. I'm not going to hurt you, old sport, Calvin said. I'm just trying to be friendly. Let's make it up, huh? You mean you're coming around? Charles Wallace asked. Sure, Calvin's voice was coaxing. We're reasonable people after all. Just look at me for a minute, Charlibus. Charles Wallace stopped and turned slowly to look at Calvin with his cold, vacant eyes. Calvin looked back, and Meg could feel the intensity of his concentration. An enormous shudder shook Charles Wallace. For a brief flash, his eyes seemed to see. Then his whole body twirled wildly and went rigid. He started his marionette walks again. I should have known better, he said. If you want to see Murry, you'd better come with me and not try any more hanky-panky. Is that what you call your father, Murry? Calvin asked. Meg could see that he was angry and upset at his near success. Father? What is a father? Charles Wallace intoned. Merely another misconception. If you feel the need of a father, then I would suggest that you turn to it. It? Again. Who's this it? Meg asked. All in good time, Charles Wallace said. You're not ready for it yet. First of all, I will tell you something about this beautiful, enlightened planet of Kamazats. His voice took on the dry, pedantic tones of Mr. Jenkins. Perhaps you do not realize that on Kamazats, we have conquered all illness, all deformity. We? Calvin interrupted. Charles continued as though he had not heard. And of course he hadn't, Meg thought. We let no one suffer. It is so much kinder, simply to annihilate anyone who is ill. Nobody has weeks and weeks of runny noses and sore throats. Rather than endure such discomfort, they are simply put to sleep. You mean they're put to sleep while they have a cold? Or that they're murdered? Calvin demanded. Murder is a most primitive word, Charles Wallace said. There's no such thing as murder on Kamazats. It takes care of all such things. He moved jerkily to the wall of the corridor, stood still for a moment, then raised his hand. The wall flickered, quivered, grew transparent. Charles Wallace walked through it, beckoned to Meg and Calvin, and they followed. They were in a small, square room from which radiated a dull, sulphurous light. There was something ominous to Meg in the very compactness of the room, as though the walls, the ceilings, the floor might move together and crush anybody rash enough to enter. How did you do that? Calvin asked Charles. Do what? Make the wall open like that. I merely rearranged the atoms, Charles Wallace said loftily. You've studied atoms in school, haven't you? Sure, but then you know enough to know that matter isn't solid, don't you? That you, Calvin, consist mostly of empty space. That if all the matter in you came together, you'd be the size of the head of a pin. That's plain scientific fact, isn't it? Yes, but so I simply pushed the atoms aside and we walked through the space between them. Meg's stomach seemed to drop, and she realized that the square box in which they stood must be an elevator, and that they had started to move upward with great speed. The yellow light lit up their faces, and the pale blue of Charles's eyes absorbed the yellow and turned green. Calvin licked his lips. Where are we going? Up, Charles continued his lecture. On Kamazat, we are all happy because we are all alike. Differences create problems. You know that, don't you, dear sister? No, Meg said. Oh, yes, you do. You've seen at home how true it is. You know that's the reason you're not happy at school, because you're different. I'm different and I'm happy, Calvin said. But you pretend that you aren't different. I'm different and I like being different, Calvin's voice said unnaturally loud. Maybe I don't like being different, Meg said, but I don't want to be like everyone else either. Charles Wallace raised his hand and the motion of the square box ceased and one of the walls seemed to disappear. Charles stepped out. Meg and Calvin followed him. Calvin just barely making it before the wall came into being again, and they could no longer see where the opening had been. You wanted Calvin to get left behind, didn't you, Meg? Meg said. I am merely trying to teach you to stay on your toes. I warn you, if I have any more trouble from either of you, I shall have to take you to it. As the word it fell from Charles's lips, again Meg felt as though she had been touched by something slimy and horrible. So, what is this it? She asked. You might call it the boss. Then Charles Wallace giggled, a giggle that was the most sinister sound Meg had ever heard. It sometimes calls itself the happiest sadist. Meg spoke coldly to cover her fear. I don't know what you're talking about. That's sadist, not saddest. Charles Wallace said and giggled again. Lots of people don't pronounce it correctly. Well, I don't care, Meg said defiantly. I don't ever want to see it, and that's that. Charles Wallace's strange, monotonous voice ground against her ears. Meg, you're supposed to have some mind. Why do you think we have wars at home? Why do you think people get confused and unhappy? Because they all live their own separate individual lives. I've been trying to explain to you in the simplest possible way that on Kamazats, individuals have been done away with. Kamazats is one mind. It's it. And that's why everybody's so happy and efficient. That's what old witches like Mrs. Whatsit don't want to have happen at home. She's not a witch, Meg interrupted. No, no, Calvin said. You know she's not. You know that's just their game, their way, maybe of laughing in the dark. In the dark is correct, Charles continued. They want us to go on being confused instead of properly organized. Meg shook her head violently. No, she shouted. I know our world isn't perfect, Charles, but it's better than this. This isn't the only alternative. It can't be. Nobody suffers here, Charles intoned. Nobody is ever unhappy. But nobody's ever happy either, Meg said earnestly. Maybe if you aren't unhappy sometimes, you don't know how to be happy. Calvin, I want to go home. We can't leave, Charles, Calvin told her. And we can't go before we found your father. You know that. But you're right, Meg, and Mrs. Witch is right. This is evil. Charles Wallace shook his head, and scorn and disapproval seemed to emanate from him. Come, we're wasting time. He moved rapidly down the corridor, but continued to speak. How dreadful it is to be low individual organisms. Tit, tit, tit. His pace quickened from step by step, his short legs flashing, so that Meg and Calvin almost had to run to keep up with him. Now see this, he said. He raised his hands, and suddenly they could see through one of the walls into a small room. In the room, a little boy was bouncing a ball. He was bouncing it in rhythm, and the walls of this little cell seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the ball. And each time the ball bounced, he screamed as though he were in pain. That's the little boy we saw this afternoon, Calvin said sharply. The little boy who wasn't bouncing the ball like the others. Charles Wallace giggled again. Yes, every once in a while, there's a little trouble with cooperation, but it's easily taken care of. After today, he'll never desire to deviate again. Ah, here we are. He moved rapidly down the corridor and again held up his hand to make the wall transparent. They looked into another room, small room or cell. In the center of it was a large, round, transparent column, and inside this column was a man. Father, Meg screamed. Wow. There was a lot of information too about atoms and things like that. Yes, 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 yes. First, I love science. I love science. This is why I'm so intrigued by all of this. I've always loved science, math, all of that. But there's a reason for science. There's a reason for math. There's a reason for spirituality, metaphysics, physics. You know what I'm saying? All of those things. And I love every single bit of it. Okay. It's intriguing. And it's the story of us and our biology, our organisms, how we are, who we are, where we are, what we are, but yes, matter. So us, it may feel and seem like we are solid beings. No, we are not. Nothing that we envision as a solid, as a, what you can pick up and hold, you know, it's, you can hold it because there's many atoms together. Okay. It's just like vacuuming your carpet, your rug. It has one dust, particle. One, if you see one dust particle, you can, it's just that one. But when you vacuum the rug, you have many dust particles, many of them, right? And then when you empty out the vacuum reservoir, you can almost grab the dust particles out of the reservoir, and you can probably hold it in your hand. What you're holding is thousands upon thousands of individual dust particles. You're not holding a ball, you're holding thousands of dust particles in one. They're closely together, closely impacted together. That's what you're holding. Nothing is ever a solid. There's no one solid thing. There is space between atoms. And so what he did when he raised his hand, he moved all of the atoms to one side and just walked through the space. So when he raised his hand to open the wall, he simply said, I'm moving the atoms to the side, and we're walking through the space between the atoms. In each one of us, there is spaces between each one of our atoms. So if somebody were to do that, what he did to the wall, if they were to do that to us, they would be able to walk straight through us. You know what I mean? By moving the atoms of us to the side. That's what that was. And I love that they touched on, I love that they touched on that, because a lot of people don't know that. Everything on this planet is not what it seems. It's an illusion, y'all, but everybody's not ready to see that or hear that or whatever the case, because cognitive dissonance is a real thing. Okay. But anyway, here we go. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. If you believe it, you believe it. If you don't, you don't. That's up to you. Okay. Alrighty. Chapter 9 is entitled It. Meg rushed at the man imprisoned in the column, but as she reached what seemed to be the open door, she was hurled back as though she had crashed into a brick wall. Calvin caught her. It's just transparent like glass this time, he told her. We can't go through it. Meg was so sick and dizzy from the impact that she could not answer. For a moment, she was afraid that she would throw up or faint. Charles Wallace laughed again, the laugh that was not his own, and it was this that saved her. For once more, anger overcome her pain and fear. Charles Wallace, her own real dear Charles Wallace, never laughed at her when she hurt herself. Instead, his arms would go quickly around her neck, and he would press his soft cheek against hers in loving comfort. But the demon Charles Wallace snickered. She turned away from him and looked again at the man in the column. Oh, Father, she whispered longingly. But the man in the column did not move to look at her. The horn rimmed glasses, which always seemed so much a part of him, were gone, and the expression of his eyes was turned inward, as though he were deep in thought. He had grown a beard, and the silky brown was shot with gray. His hair, too, had not been cut. It wasn't just the overlong hair of the man in the snapshot at Cape Canaveral. It was pushed back from his high forehead and fell softly, almost with no question. It fell softly to his shoulders, so that he looked like someone in another century or a shipwrecked sailor. But there was no question, despite the change in him, that he was her father, her own beloved father. My, he looks a mess, doesn't he? Charles Wallace said and sniggered. Meg swung on him with sick rage. Charles, that's father. Father. So what? Meg turned away from him and held out her arms to the man in the column. He doesn't see us, Meg, Calvin said gently. Why? Why? I think it's sort of like those little peepholes they have in apartments in the front doors. Calvin explained. From inside you can look through and see everything, and from outside you can't see anything at all. We can see him, but he can't see us. Charles, Meg pleaded, let me into father. Why? Charles says placidly. Meg remembered that when they were in the room with the man with the red eyes, he had knocked Charles Wallace back into himself when she tackled him and his head cracked the floor. So she hurled herself at him. But before she could reach him, his fist shot out and punched her hard in the stomach. She gasped for breath. Sickly, she turned away from her brother, back to the transparent wall. There was the cell. There was the column with her father inside. Although she could see him, although she was almost close enough to touch him, he seemed farther away than he had been when she had pointed him out to Calvin in the picture on the piano. He stood there quietly as though frozen in a column of ice, an expression of suffering and endurance on his face that pierced into her heart like an arrow. You say you want to help father? Charles Wallace's voice came from behind her with no emotion whatsoever. Yes, don't you? Meg demanded, swinging around, glaring at him. But of course, that is why we're here. Then what do we do? Meg tried to keep the franticness out of her voice, trying to sound as drained of feelings as Charles, but nevertheless ending on a squeak. You must do as I have and go into it, Charles said. No, I can see you don't really want to save father. How would my being a zombie save father? You would just have to take my word for it, Margaret, came the cold, flat voice from Charles Wallace. It wants you, and it will get you. Don't forget that I, too, am part of it now. I wouldn't have done it if it weren't the right thing to do. Calvin, Meg asked in agony, will it really save father? But Calvin was paying no attention to her. He seemed to be concentrating with all his power on Charles Wallace. He stared into the pale blue that was all that was left of Charles Wallace's eyes. And for thou waste a spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands. She did confine thee into a cloven pine, he whispered, and Meg recognized Mrs. Who's words to him. For a moment, Charles Wallace seemed to listen, and then he shrugged and turned away. Calvin followed him, trying to keep his eyes focused on Charles's. If you want a witch, Charles, he said, it's the witch, not our ladies. Good thing I had the Tempest at school this year, isn't it, Charles? It was the witch who put Ariel in the cloven pine, wasn't it? Charles Wallace's voice seemed to come from a great distance. Stop staring at me. Breathing quickly with excitement, Calvin continued to pin Charles Wallace with his stare. You're like Ariel in the cloven pine, Charles, and I can let you out. Look at me, Charles. Come back to us. Again, the shudder went through Charles Wallace. Calvin's intense voice hit at him. Come back, Charles. Come back to us. Again, Charles shuddered, and then it was as though an invisible hand had smacked against his chest and knocked him to the ground. And the stare with which Calvin had held him was broken. Charles sat there on the floor of the corridor, whimpering, not a small boy's sound, but a fearful animal noise. Calvin, Meg turned on him, clasping her hands intensely. Try to get father. Calvin shook his head. Charles almost came out. I almost did it. He almost came back to us. Try father, Meg said again. How? Your cloven pine thing. Isn't father imprisoned in a cloven pine even more than Charles? Look at him in that column there. Get him out, Calvin. Calvin spoke in an exhausted way. Meg, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get in. Meg, they're asking too much of us. Mrs. Who's spectacles, Meg said suddenly. Mrs. Who had told her to use them only as a last resort, and surely that was now. She reached into her pocket, and the spectacles were there, cool and light and comforting. With trembling fingers, she pulled them out. Give me those spectacles, Charles Wallace's voice came in a harsh command, and he scrambled up off the floor and ran at her. She barely had time to snatch off her own glasses and put on Mrs. Who's, and as it was, One earpiece dropped down her cheek, and they barely stayed on her nose. As Charles Wallace lunged at her, she flung herself against the transparent door, and she was through it. Mm. She was in the cell with the imprisoning column that held her father. With trembling fingers, she straightened Mrs. Who's glasses and put her own in the pocket. Give them to me, said Charles Wallace's menacing voice, and he was in the cell with her, with Calvin on the outside, pounding frantically to get in. Meg kicked at Charles Wallace and ran at the column. She felt as though she were going through something dark and cold, but she was through. Father, she cried, and she was in his arms. This was the moment for which she had been waiting, not only since Mrs. Witch whisked them off on their journeys, but during the long months and years before, when the letters had stopped coming, when people made remarks about Charles Wallace, when Mrs. Murry showed a rare flash of loneliness or grief. This was the moment that meant that now and forever everything would be all right. As she pressed against her father, all was forgotten except joy. There was only the peace and comfort of leaning against him, the wonder of the protecting circle of his arms, the feelings of complete reassurance and safety that his presence always gave her. Her voice broke on a happy sob. Oh, Father, Meg, he cried in glad surprise. Meg, what are you doing here? Where's your mother? Where are the boys? She looked at the column, and there was Charles Wallace in the cell, an alien expression distorting his face. She turned back to her father. There was no more time for greeting, for joy, for explanation. We have to go to Charles Wallace, she said, her words tense. Quickly. Her father's hands were moving gropingly over his face, and as she felt the touch of his strong, gentle fingers, she realized with a flooding of horror that she could see him, that she could see Charles in the cell and Calvin in the corridor, but her father could not see them, could not see her. She looked at him in panic, but his eyes were the same steady blue that she remembered. She moved her hand brusquely over his line of vision, and he did not blink. Father, she cried, Father, can't you see me? His arms went around her again in a comforting, reassuring gesture. No, Meg. But Father, I can see you. Her voice trailed off. Suddenly, she shoved Mrs. Who's glasses down her nose and peered over them, and immediately she was in complete and utter darkness. She snatched them off her face and thrust them at her father. Here. His fingers closed about the spectacles. Darling, he said, I'm afraid your glasses won't help. But they're Mrs. Who's. They aren't mine, she explained, not realizing that her words would sound like gibberish to him. Please try them, Father, please. She waited while she felt him fumbling in the dark. Can you see now? She asked. Can you see, Father? Yes, he said. Yes, the wall is transparent now. How extraordinary. I could almost see the atoms rearranging. His voice had his old familiar sound of excitement and discovery. It was the way he sounded sometimes when he came home from his laboratory after a good day and began to tell his wife about his work. Then he cried out, Charles Wallace. And then, Meg, what's happening to him? What's wrong? That is Charles, isn't it? It has him, Father, she explained tensely. He's gone into it. Father, we have to help him. For a long moment, Mr. Murry was silent. The silence was filled with the words he was thinking and would not speak out loud to his daughter. Then he said, Meg, I'm in prison here. I've been for, Father, these walls. You can go through them. I came through the column to get into you. It was Mrs. Who's glasses. Mr. Murry did not stop to ask who Mrs. Who was. He slapped his hand against the translucent column. It seemed solid enough. But I got in, Meg repeated. I'm here. Maybe the glasses help the atoms rearrange. Try it, Father. She waited breathlessly, and after a moment she realized that she was alone in the column. She put out her hand in the darkness and felt its smooth surface curving about her all the sides. She seemed utterly alone, the silence and darkness impenetrable forever. She fought down panic until she heard her father's voice coming to her very faintly. I'm coming back in for you, Meg. It was almost a tangible feeling as the atoms of the strange material seemed to part, to let him through to her. In their beach house at Cape Canaveral, there had been a curtain between dining and living room, okay, made of long strands of rice. It looked like a solid curtain, but you could walk through it. At first, Meg had flinched each time she came up to the curtain, but gradually she got used to it and would go running right through, leaving the long strands of rice swinging behind her. Perhaps the atoms of these walls were arranged in somewhat the same fashion. Put your arms around my neck, Meg, Mr. Murry said. Hold on to me tightly. Close your eyes and don't be afraid. He picked her up and she wrapped her long legs around his waist and clung to his neck. With Mrs. Who's spectacles on, she felt only a faint darkness and coldness as she moved through the column. Without the glasses, she felt the same awful clamminess she had felt when they tessered through the outer darkness of Kamazat's. Whatever the black thing was to which Kamazat's had submitted, it was within as well as without the planet. For a moment, it seemed that the chill darkness would tear her from her father's arms. She tried to scream, but within the icy horror, no sound was possible. Her father's arms tightened about her, and she clung to his neck in a stranglehold. But she was no longer lost in panic. She knew that if her father could not get through the wall, he would stay with her rather than leave her. She knew that she was safe as long as she was in his arms. Then they were outside. The column rose up in the middle of the room, crystal clear and empty. Meg blinked at the blurred figures of Charles and her father and wondered why they did not clear. Then she grabbed her own glasses out of her pocket and put them on, and her myopic eyes were able to focus. Charles Wallace was tapping one foot impatiently against the floor. It is not pleased, he said. It is not pleased at all. Mr. Murry released Meg and knelt in front of the little boy. Charles, his voice was tender. Charles Wallace, what do you want? I'm your father, Charles. Look at me. The pale blue eyes seemed to focus on Mr. Murry's face. Hi, Pop, came an insolent voice. That isn't Charles, Meg cried. Oh, Father, Charles isn't like that. It has him. Yes, Mr. Murry sounded tired. I see. He held his arms out. Charles, come here. Father will make it all right, Meg thought. Everything will be all right now. Charles did not move toward the outstretched arms. He stood a few feet away from his father, and he did not look at him. Look at me, Mr. Murry commanded. No. Mr. Murry's voice became harsh. When you speak to me, you will say no, Father, or no, sir. Come off it, Pop, came the cold voice from Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace, who, outside Kamazat's, had been strange, had been different, but never rude. You're not the boss around here. Meg could see Calvin pounding again on the glass wall. Calvin, she called. He can't hear you, Charles said. He made a horrible face at Calvin, and then he thumbed his nose. Who's Calvin? Mr. Murry asked. Meg started, but Charles Wallace cut her off. You'll have to defer your explanations. Let's go. Go where? To it. No, Mr. Murry said. You can't take Meg there. Oh, can't I? No, you cannot. You're my son, Charles, and I'm afraid you will have to do as I say. But he isn't Charles, Meg cried in anguish. Why didn't her father understand? Charles is nothing like that, Father. You know he's nothing like that. He was only a baby when I left, Mr. Murry said heavily. Father, it's it talking through Charles. It isn't Charles. He's bewitched. Fairy tales again, Charles said. You know it, Father, Meg asked. Yes. Have you seen it? Yes, Meg. Again, his voice sounded exhausted. Yes, I have. He turned to Charles. You know she wouldn't be able to hold out. Exactly, Charles said. Father, you can't talk to him as though he were Charles. Ask Calvin. Calvin will tell you. Come along, Charles Wallace said. We must go. He held up his hand carelessly, and walked out of the cell, and there was nothing for Meg or Mr. Murry to do but follow. As they stepped into the corridor, Meg caught her father's sleeve. Calvin, here's Father. Calvin turned anxiously toward them. His freckles and his hair stood out brilliantly against his white face. Make your introductions later, Charles Wallace said. It does not like to be kept waiting. He walked down the corridor, his gait seeming to get more jerky with each step. The others followed, walking rapidly to keep up. Does your father know about the Mrs. W's? Calvin asked Meg. There hasn't been time for anything. Everything's awful. Despair settled like a stone in the pit of Meg's stomach. She had been so certain that the moment she found her father, everything would be all right. Everything would be settled. All the problems would be taken out of her hands. She would no longer be responsible for anything. And instead of this happy and unexpected and expected outcome, they seemed to be encountering all kinds of new troubles. He doesn't understand about Charles, she whispered to Calvin, looking unhappily at her father's back as he walked behind the little boy. Where are we going? Calvin asked. To it. Calvin, I don't want to go. I can't. She stopped, but Charles continued his jerky pace. We can't leave Charles, Calvin said. They wouldn't like it. Who wouldn't? Mrs. Watson and Co. But they betrayed us. They brought us here to this terrible place and abandoned us. Calvin looked at her in surprise. You sit down and give up if you like, he said. I'm sticking with Charles. He ran to keep up with Charles Wallace and Mr. Murry. I didn't mean, Meg started and pounded after them. Just as she caught up with them, Charles Wallace stopped and raised his hand. And there was the elevator again, its yellow light sinister. Meg felt her stomach jerk as the swift descent began. They were silent until the motion stopped, silent as they followed Charles Wallace through long corridors and out into the street. The Central Intelligence Building loomed up, stark and angular behind them. Do something, Meg implored her father silently. Do something. Help save us. They turned a corner, and at the end of the street was a strange, dome-like building. Its walls glowed with the flicker of violet flame. Its silvery roof pulsed with ominous light. The light was neither warm nor cold, but it seemed to reach out and touch them. This, Meg was sure, must be where it was waiting for them. They moved down the street more slowly now, and as they came closer to the dome building, the violet flickering seemed to reach out, to envelop them, to suck them in. They were inside. Meg could feel a rhythmical pulsing. It was a pulsing not only about her, but in her as well, as though the rhythm of her heart and lungs was no longer her own, but was being worked by some outside force. The closest she had come to the feeling before was when she had been practicing artificial respiration with Girl Scouts, and the leader, an immensely powerful woman, had been working on Meg, intoning out goes the bad air, in comes the good air, while her heavy hands released. Meg gasped, trying to breathe at her own normal rate. But the inexorable beat within and without continued. For a moment, she could neither move nor look around to see what was happening to the others. She simply had to stand there, trying to balance herself into the artificial rhythm of her heart and lungs. Her eyes seemed to swim in a sea of red. Then things began to clear. Then she could breathe without gasping like a beached fish, and she could look about the great circular dome building. It was completely empty except for the pulse, which seemed a tangible thing, and a round dice exactly in the center. On the dice lay what? Meg could not tell, and yet she knew that it was from this that the rhythm came. She stepped forward tentatively. She felt that she was beyond fear now. Charles Wallace was no longer Charles Wallace. Her father had been found, but had not made everything all right. Instead, everything was worse than ever, and her adored father was bearded and thin and white and not omnipotent after all. No matter what happened next, things could be more terrible or could be more terrible or frightening than they already were. Couldn't they? As she continued to step slowly forward, at last she realized that the thing on the dice was what the thing on the dice was. It was a brain, a disembodied brain, an oversized brain, just enough larger than normal to be completely revolting and terrifying. A living brain, a brain that pulsed and quivered, that seized and commanded. No wonder the brain was called it. It was the most horrible, the most repellent thing she had ever seen, far more nauseating than anything she had ever imagined with her conscious mind, or that had ever tormented her in the most terrible nightmares. But as she had felt, she was beyond fear. So now she was beyond screaming. She looked at Charles Wallace, and he stood there, turned toward it, his jaw hanging slightly loose, and his vacant blue eyes slowly twirled. Oh, yes, things could always be worse. These twirling eyes within Charles Wallace's sound, round face made Meg icy cold inside and out. Okay. She looked away from Charles Wallace and at her father. Her father stood there with Mrs. Who's glasses still perched on his nose. Did he remember that he had them on? And she shouted to Calvin, "Don't give in. I won't. Help Meg. I won't. Help Meg." Okay, Calvin yelled back. It was absolutely silent within the dome, and yet Meg realized that the only way to speak was to shout with all the power possible. For everyone, for everywhere she looked, everywhere she turned was the rhythm. And as it continued to control the systole and diastole, the systole and diastole, okay, of her heart, the intake and outlet of her breath, the red miasma began to creep before her eyes again. And she was afraid that she was going to lose consciousness. And if she did, that she would be completely in the power of it. This is what it has said: Meg, I give you your faults. What were her greatest faults? Anger, impatience, stubbornness. Yes, it was her faults that she turned to save herself. Mm. With an immense effort, she tried to breathe against the rhythm of it, but its power was too strong. Each time she managed to take a breath out of rhythm, an iron hand seemed to squeeze her heart and lungs. Then she remembered that when they had been standing before the man with red eyes had been intoning the multiplication table at them. Charles Wallace had fought against this power by shouting out nursery rhymes, and Calvin by the Gettysburg Address. "Georgie, Porgy, Pudding Pie," she yelled, kissed the girls and made them cry. That was no good. It was too easy for nursery rhymes to fall into the rhythm of it. She didn't know the Gettysburg Address. How did the Declaration of Independence begin? She had memorized it only that winter, not because she was required to at school, but simply because she liked it. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," she shouted, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As she cried out the words, she felt as she cried out the words, she felt a mind moving in on her, felt it seizing, squeezing her brain. Then she realized that Charles Wallace was speaking or being spoken through by it. But that's exactly what we have on Kamazats: complete equality, everybody exactly alike. For a moment, her brain reeled with confusion. Then came a moment of blazing truth. "No," she cried triumphantly. "Like and equal are not the same thing at all." "Good girl, Meg," her father shouted at her. But Charles Wallace continued as though there had been no interruption. "In Kamazats, all are equal. In Kamazats, everybody is the same as everybody else." But he gave her no argument, provided no answer, and she held on to her moment of revelation. Like and equal are two entirely different things. For the moment, she had escaped from the power of it. But how? She knew that her own puny little brain was no match for this great bodiless, pulsing, writhing mass on the round dice. She shuddered as she looked at it. In the lab at school, there was a human brain preserved in formaldehyde, and the seniors preparing for college had to take it out, look at it, and study it. Meg had felt that when that day came, she would never be able to endure it. But now she thought that if only she had a dissecting knife, She would slash at it, cutting ruthlessly through cerebrum and cerebellum. Words spoke within her, directly this time, not through Charles. Don't you realize that if you destroy me, you also destroy your little brother? If that great brain were crushed, would every mind under its control on Kamazat's die too? Charles Wallace and the man with red eyes and the man who ran the number one spelling machine on the second grade level and all the children playing ball and skipping rope and all the mothers and all the men and women going in and out of the buildings, would their life completely be dependent on it? Were they beyond all possibility of salvation? She felt the brain reaching at her again, and she let her stubborn control slip. Red fog glazed her eyes. Faintly, she heard her father's voice, though she knew he was shouting at the top of his lungs. The periodic table of elements, Meg. Say it. A picture flashed into her mind, and winter evenings spent sitting before the open fire and studying with her father. Hydrogen, helium, she started obediently. Keep them in their proper atomic order. What next? She knew it. Yes, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine. She shouted the words at her father, turned away from it. Neon, sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicone, phosphorus. Too rhythmical, her father shouted. What's the square root of 5? For a moment, she was able to concentrate. Rack your brains yourself, Meg. Don't let it rack them. The square root of 5 is 2.263, she cried triumphantly, because 2.263 times 2.263 equals 5. What's the square root of 7? The square root of 7 is, she broke off. She wasn't holding out. It was getting at her, and she couldn't concentrate, not even on math. And soon she, too, would be absorbed in it. She would be an it. Tesser, sir, she heard Calvin's voice through the red darkness. Tesser. She felt her father grab her by the wrist. There was a terrible jerk that seemed to break every bone in her body. Then the dark nothing of tessering. If tessering with Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which had been a strange and fearful experience, it was nothing like tessering with her father. After all, Mrs. Which was experienced at it, and Mrs. Murry and Mr. Murry, how did he know anything about it at all? Meg felt that she was being torn apart by a whirlwind. She was lost in an agony of pain that finally dissolved into the darkness of complete unconsciousness. Oh my goodness. Ooh, that was brain power. Mm, 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 mm. My goodness. Okay. Alrighty. So I was looking at the comment here that I received. I'm going to read it myself. Okay. So I'm going to delete this because it's a I believe this is a spam, a robot. Okay. So that was y'all. That was chapters 8 and 9. My goodness. Oof. So the next chapter is chapter 10. We're going to do 10 and 11 on Tuesday. Man, that was something. Oh my God. That mind control. That mind control. Listen, you all, if you're listening to this, we could equate that powerful mind control to what's happening today. Entertainment, television, all of that, my social media. Oh my goodness. And just like her and her father and Calvin were fighting to not allow themselves to be sucked into the control of the it, they had to do other things. They were using poetry, they were using math, they were using the Gettysburg Address, they were using science, the periodic table, to break the chain, to break the hold. Because everything under the mind control of it looks the same, acts the same, walks the same, does the same, speaks the same, thinks the same. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. You all, there's so much relevance here. There's so much relevance here. My word, this was good. So on Tuesday, well, first of all, before we even go into that, understand that you can get this book. This book is free of charge to you, okay? It is free. Get your free copy. It is a PDF version. This ebook PDF version for you to receive via Google Drive, and you can have it. You can pull it up wherever you want to pull it up from. If you want to, if you're eating lunch at work and you want to read, or whatever the case, the chapters are not long at all. We started at 5. It's just 6 after 6. You know what I mean? So it's not even. It doesn't take long, and we read 2 chapters in just that hour. So you can knock it out. If you want to read along with us, you can. If you want to read it on your own, you absolutely can. You don't have to wait on us, and or you can journey with us. It's up to you. But email me at info@biancamissblee.com and request your copy. Give me the email address that you want me to send this copy to, and I'll send it to you, no problem. Of course, I am a nonprofit organization. I am a 501c3, and we do accept donations. However, it is not required. It's welcome. It's not required. Okay. If you want more information on where you can send donations, you can do that. Go to my website right there. It is on the screen, and is on Clubhouse. Is right above my head. You can tap there. Go straight there. On all other platforms, it's on the screen. BiancaMissBlee.com. You will see a tab where it says Beyond the Scenes, Behind the Scenes. You'll see all of that. And that is a nonprofit organization. You can go there. You can see all of the programs that we offer, what we do in the communities and things like that. And you can see donate now. Okay. You'll be able to donate, and it'll go straight to our nonprofit account. Okay. So us to continue to do the work that we do in the communities for men, women, children, for the unhoused, for the returning citizens, those returning from prison systems back into civilization, giving them the mental health treatments that they need, giving them the counseling that they need, giving them the spiritual direction and guidance that they need, even financial preparedness, even jobs, work ready programs and things like that for all. Yes, 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 we do it all. Okay. We do it all for the community, for each other, because we are indeed stronger together. Okay. So go there and see everything that we do. And you can also visit the website and see any services of mine that you would like to take part of. Okay. Do that. You can purchase my books. You can sign up for services. You can take some of my courses. Do all of that. You'll get it right there. You'll be able to also see the most recent astrological transits that we have there for you. You can check those out as well to see what's happening in the cosmos and how you can tap into the energy of what's happening and harness it for yourself and make it work for you. Okay. Alrighty, you all follow me on social media as well: Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, every platform, TikTok. Go there under all Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee. It's all every platform. Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee. LinkedIn, all anywhere. Anywhere. Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee. Okay. Alrighty, you all. That is it for now. We will be back here on Tuesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here at Divine Femininity United. I'm actually going to be doing a new name rebrand, because once upon a time, when I first started this platform back in 2000, we were Divine Femininity. So we were working with women only. Well, we're not women only. We're probably majority women, but we are both divine feminine and masculine. So we are going to be changing our name here. Not too far off, but it's going to be all inclusive. Okay. Especially with the energy out here of disbanding, diversity and inclusion and equality. Nope, 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 nope. We are pro diversity, equality, and inclusion, and we will be diverse, equal, and inclusive. Okay, so we're rebranding right now. We're gonna have a new name. It's not gonna be far off, but it's gonna be definitely indicative of who we are as a collective. All right. So be on the lookout for that. All right. With that being said, if you have any questions or whatever, you have any comments or whatever, you want to reach out to me, please do so. Don't hesitate. don't hesitate to do so, okay? You can also call my office, 706-570-2630. Again, 706-570-2630. All right? All right, you all, listen. Once again, I love you. I mean it. There is absolutely positively nothing that you can do about it. Don't you even try it. It will not work, okay? I will see you all back here on Tuesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here at Divine Femininity United. Peace.